Well, good morning, folks. Appreciate you being here yet again. This camera in the middle so I don't look so funny. And we are proceeding through our Hero Tales book. I got a question last week. What book will we do next? I think I'm going to need to pick one for the spring semester. Because it looks like we'll still be locked down for the season of pestilence in 2021. We'll see how that goes. Anyway, this morning, as we proceed through Hero Tales, we have a chapter about another local Boston boy. I think that Roosevelt was pretty prominent in society, and Charles Russell Lowell, well, and Henry Cabot Lodge, these were his folks. So maybe Boston gets a little overrepresented in the book Hero Tales. And this month's story about a member of the prominent Lowell family is introduced with a verse by a different member of the Lowell family, a fellow who wrote verses in what he thought was dialect. It was supposed to represent the speech of the lower classes, a little bit like Rudyard Kipling writing Gunga Din. You may talk of gin and beer when you're quartered safe out here. It wasn't the way Rudyard Kipling spoke, but the way that he thought individual soldiers spoke, minus the cussing. So the verse here, and I've been trying to locate the entire poem it's from. I haven't been able to yet. What's words to them whose faith and truth on war's red touchstone rang true metal, who ventured life and love and youth for the great prize of death in battle? To him who, deadly hurt, again flashed on afore the charge's thunder, tipping with fire the bolt of men that rived the rebel line asunder. So, this session's subject, Charles Russell Lowell, is a member of a prominent Boston family, just like our previous subject was, Robert Gould Shaw. If you were here last Thursday, we talked about Robert Gould Shaw and his command of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. Shaw was an abolitionist officer, killed at Battery Wagner. Charles Russell Lowell happens to be Shaw's brother-in-law. He actually married a sister of Robert Gould Shaw. Born in Boston in 1835, Lowell grew up highly educated in a prominent family, and this is going to be one of the points that they make today, maybe the central point of this particular essay, is that, like Robert Gould Shaw, what did they say about Shaw last week? He had all that birth and wealth, breeding, education, and tradition could give. He had inherited a social place and had the advantages of money, of education, of being well connected in society. He was a healthy young man, and he entered Harvard College in 1850. Charles Russell Lowell was one of the youngest members of his class, but went rapidly to the front. Youngest members of his class now, let's do the math there. Born in 1835, he entered Harvard at 15. And yet, he went rapidly to the front and graduated not only the first scholar of his year, but also the foremost man of his class. He was, however, much more than a fine scholar. He read widely and loved letters. He was a student of philosophy and religion, a thinker, and best of all, a man of ideals, the glory of youth, as he called them in his valedictory oration. But he was something still better and finer than a mere idealist. He was a man of action, eager to put his ideals into practice and bring them to the test of daily life. We can rely upon Roosevelt and Lodge to encourage us to be people of action. And a man of action is what they praise this brilliant young man for being. In fact, he entered the iron mills of the Ames Company at Chicopee, Massachusetts. Now, the Ames Company, ironically, is probably going to be the company that makes the sword that he will carry in the war. Ames was a big sword manufacturer. But Charles Russell Lowell isn't even thinking about that at this point in the 1850s. He enters the iron mills and works as an ordinary working man in the iron mills for 6 months. He's a bit of a social activist, and then gets an important post in the Trenton Iron Works of New Jersey. There his health broke down. Consumption threatened him. Consumption is tuberculosis. So he's apparently diagnosed with tuberculosis at a fairly young age. All his bright hopes and ambitions were overcast and checked. He was obliged to leave his business and go to Europe, where he traveled for 2 years fighting the dread disease that was upon him. In 1858, he returned and took a position on a Western railroad. In 1860, he took charge of the Mount Savage Iron Works at Cumberland, Maryland. So this young businessman who has shown wide intellectual interests, but he hasn't really shown any military interest at all. But he's right there on the spot in Maryland in 1860 when civil disorder is breaking out and the divisions between the sections are becoming violent. News came of the attack made by the mob upon the 6th Massachusetts Regiment in Baltimore, referred to in the South as the Baltimore Massacre, from the casualties taken by the demonstrators from the Massachusetts Regiment. But to Charles, and indeed to Henry Cabot Lodge and perhaps Theodore Roosevelt, the soldiers are in the right, the mob is in the wrong, and Charles Russell Lowell at once applied for a commission in the regular army. So he's going to become an officer in the Union Army. In May, he received his commission as captain in the United States Cavalry. Oh, let's pause there for a second. There he is with his darling bride, Robert Gould Shaw's sister, who is wearing a very 1860s hairstyle, by the way. And here we have a guidon of a U.S., or actually a Massachusetts cavalry regiment that he would become part of. That May, that is 1861, as the war breaks out, he gets a commission as a captain in the United States Cavalry. Employed at first in recruiting and then in drill, he gave himself up to the study of tactics and the science of war. This is a brand new thing for him. It's not something he studied at Harvard. It's not something he was oriented to in his childhood. And Roosevelt and Lodge make the point. All his great qualities of mind and heart, his high courage, his power of leadership and of organization, and his intellectual powers could find full play. He moved rapidly forward, just as he had already done in college and in business. His regiment in 1862 was under Stoneman in the peninsula and was engaged in many actions where Lowell's cool bravery made him constantly conspicuous. He's going to be promoted quickly, makes it all the way up to major in 1862. Sent with orders to General Sedgwick's division, he found it retreating in confusion under a hot fire. He did not stop to think of orders, but rode rapidly from point to point of the line, rallying company after company by the mere force and power of his word and look, checking the rout while the storm of bullets swept all round him. His horse was shot under him. A ball passed through his coat. Another broke his sword hilt, but he came off unscathed, and his service was recognized by his being sent to Washington with the captured flags of the enemy. So a very successful day for the young brevet major. The following winter, he was ordered to Boston to recruit a regiment of cavalry, of which he was appointed colonel. So while he's still on recruiting duty, there's an incident in his career that is just barely mentioned in the Roosevelt, but I'm going to go a little further in it. While the recruiting was going on, a serious mutiny broke out. But the man who, like Cromwell's soldiers, rejoiced greatly in the day of battle, was entirely capable of meeting this different trial. He shot the ringleader dead, and by the force of his own strong will, quelled the outbreak completely and at once. So Lowell is a man who, when the army was panicking, he had ridden from one company to another on his horse, restoring order and getting them back into action, keeping them from panicking. But now on recruiting duty at home in Boston, he finds himself facing some troops that are in revolt. They are, many of them, drafted Irishmen, and the recruiting office was at 2 City Hall near the old State House there in Boston. On April 9th, 1863, a fight had broken out in the basement, which served as a barracks. A sergeant had tried to arrest a recruit for drunkenness. Another recruit shouted, "You shan't do that to any man in this place." Then they began cussing. The sergeant was rushed by the men and beat up. He ran away to tell his lieutenant and the recruiting officer, and Charles Russell Lowell arrived on the scene. He led the police downstairs, ordered the men to halt. Then he ordered Lynch to step forward and the police to handcuff him. The men swore that he should not be handcuffed. Lowell asked for a weapon. He was handed a Colt revolver. He told the men they were in a state of mutiny. They would probably be court-martialed and could even hang. The order must be obeyed. After it is obeyed, I will hear what you have to say and will decide the case, but it must be obeyed first, Lowell said. God knows I don't want to kill any of you, but I shall shoot the first man who resists. The men waved their sabers, cutting a corporal on the head and slashing the recruiting officer on the wrist. A 23-year-old soldier named William Pendergrast lunged. Lowell stepped forward and shot him. He fell to the floor without a word and died in 4 minutes. Then Lowell marched out of the recruiting office, walked to the State House, and walked into the governor's office. He saluted Governor John Andrew and said, "I have to report to you, sir, that in the discharge of my duty, I have shot a man." He saluted and left. The governor turned after he walked out of the office to the men around him and said, "Well, I don't need anything more from him. Colonel Lowell is as humane as he is brave." So the governor knew him personally, took his word for it, that he had shot a man, but it needed to be done, and it was in the discharge of his duty, and that was it. It was fine. That sort of shows not just the good war record that Lowell had made, but also the firm trust that these sort of higher up in society folks had in one another. He wasn't questioned on that at all. Well, Lowell is going to lead these men into battle later at Cedar Creek. There are other incidents that happened first. A couple of times, the colonel saves the regiment from a panic. That this seems to be sort of a theme they put in here of his rallying panicked men, standing down a mutiny. It seems like Charles Russell Lowell is not always dealing with the highest quality troops, especially after a draft has been passed, and some of the men are not very excited about being there. At Cedar Creek, and we're going to hear all about Sheridan at Cedar Creek on Thursday, the overall commander of the cavalry. But now we'll look at Lowell's personal part in this, his last battle. Lowell had advanced early in the morning on the right, and his attack prevented the disaster on that wing which fell upon the surprised army. He moved to cover the retreat and around to the left, where he held his position near Middleton against repeated assaults. Early in the day, his last horse was shot under him, and a little later, in a charge at 1 o'clock, he was struck in the right breast by a spent ball. That was a musket ball that had traveled a long way and lost a lot of its force over distance, which embedded itself in the muscles of his chest. So it wasn't that spent. Voice and strength left him. "It was only my poor lung," he announced, as they urged him to go to the rear. "You would not have me leave the field without having shed blood." As a matter of fact, the poor lung had collapsed, and there was an internal hemorrhage. He lay thus under a rude shelter for an hour and a half. Then came the order to advance along the whole line. Lowell was helped to his saddle. "I feel well now," he whispered, giving his orders through one of his staff, had his brigade ready first. Leading the great charge, he dashed forward, and just when the fight was hottest, a sudden cry went up, "The colonel is hit!" He fell from the saddle, struck in the neck by a ball which severed the spine, and was borne by his officers to a house in the village where, clear in mind and calm in spirit, he died a few hours afterward. "I do not think there was a quality," said General Sheridan, "which I could have added to Lowell. He was the perfection of a man and a soldier." On the very day in which he fell, his commission was signed to be a brigadier general. This was a noble life and a noble death, our authors tell us, worthy of much thought and admiration from all men. Yet this is not all. This is not all. Each time that we've gone over one of these essays, I've tried to look at what the lessons are that the authors want us to pull out of it, and why a particular person or battle or ship or whatever they're discussing was chosen. And this time, this is a long entry in the Hero Tales. And it is, maybe 10 pages long? Really long one. And after the first 5 pages, the main subject of the essay is dead. So, they would have ended some of their other chapters with the comment about his noble death, and that would have been it. But there is a point that they really want to make, and they do it by quoting some of his writings and letters, and you can read some of these things for yourself. Often writings that he wrote about how he envisioned the improvement of the nation itself. Now, Roosevelt and Lodge have been careful to show us heroes from both the North and the South in their essays. But Roosevelt and Lodge are also both late 1800s Republicans, and they believe that the end of slavery was an important part of moving the nation forward. And they have an idea of what forward means. How does that hymn go? Patriot dream that sees beyond the years, thine alabaster cities gleam, undimmed by human tears. These men want to create a better nation, and they find in Charles Russell Lowell's writings some things they have in common about what they'd like to see in the nation. And they point that out. But the biggest point that they make, the thing that I think gets both of these old upper class Yankees right in the heart, is Charles Russell Lowell is the kind of man who stands out in their society as privileged, wealthy, upper class, well-educated. He went to Harvard, like I believe both of these men did. And when it came down to it, he didn't sit back in the war, but went forward and sacrificed himself. And that's what they really want to drive home. As they get to the end of their essay, they praise the man quite a bit, but the point they really make, Charles Lowell has the same meaning for us when rightly understood. The same meaning as an Englishman in the previous paragraph. He had all that birth, breeding, education, and tradition could give. That's what they said about Robert Gould Shaw, very, very similar. He was inherited the gifts of birth, a good family, breeding, a connected family and a distinguished history, education at Harvard, and tradition. All of these things went to give him good things that moved him forward in life. The resources of our American life and civilization could produce nothing better. How would he and such men as he stand the great ordeal when it came? That's their question. The rich, the well-connected, Roosevelt and Lodge there are men of the same type. And what they're driving home is, if you had all these blessings from the nation, if you had all these blessings you were born into, you need to stand up in times of crisis and be willing to move forward and, if necessary, to sacrifice. They write, if wealth, education, and breeding were to result in a class who could only carp and criticize, accumulate money, give way to self-indulgent, and cherish low foreign ideals, then would it have appeared there was radical unsoundness in our society. Refinement would have proved to be weakness, and the highest education would have been shown to be a curse rather than a blessing. There's a warning there. They're saying, if you went to a great college and the result was that you come out selfish and promoting not the ideals of our nation, but low foreign ideals, that all you do is criticize and accumulate and never put yourself on the line, then the education you got was a curse, not a blessing. But Charles Lowell and hundreds of others like him all over the land met the great task and emerged triumphant. Then they brag about Harvard for a paragraph and a half. Charles Lowell and those like him showed once for all that the men to whom fortune has been kindest were capable of the noblest patriotism and shrank from no sacrifices. They taught the lesson which can never be heard too often, that the man to whom the accidents of birth and fortune have given the most is the man who owes the most to his country. If patriotism should exist anywhere, it should be strongest with such men as these. This is a creed that Roosevelt's going to live by, and that really is illustrated, I think, really well. Now remember, this book was written before he went to the Spanish-American War and led the Rough Riders. But here we have a pictures of two of the Rough Riders. Roosevelt's idea was to go recruit cowboys who could already shoot and ride very well. But he also found room for some of his high society New England friends, men who had birth, breeding, education, wealth, all of those tremendous things. In fact, the young man holding the machine gun there, his name is William Tiffany. And if you've ever heard of Tiffany's, the famous store in New York, that was the fortune that he was in line to inherit as a young man when he joined the Rough Riders. The gentleman on the right, Woodbury Mason, he was also prominent in New England society, wealthy and well-placed, and he's one of the people who put up the money to buy machine guns for the Rough Riders. The Rough Riders, machine guns were not military issue, and these men felt not only, despite their wealth, they should volunteer to go serve in the war, but also that because of their wealth, they should put a little extra into giving their unit an edge, an extra advantage in combat. And those machine guns turned out to be very handy indeed for that. They were private purchase. Like Charles Russell Lowell, William Tiffany did not survive. He died in service. He never inherited that vast fortune, but he did show that the same things Roosevelt and Lodge were preaching were being taken to heart by some, that if patriotism should exist anywhere, it ought to exist among the people who have inherited the most from their families and society in our nation. So I'm going to admit the first time I read through this particular chapter, I sort of felt like, well, there they are praising their particular home folks again. They've already done Robert Gould Shaw, and it's almost redundant to do the same thing with Charles Russell Lowell. But as I read, it really became clear to me the points that they wanted to drive home and how strongly Roosevelt and Lodge felt that crisis and emergency, and particularly that a war should never be something that is, as they say, a rich man's war and a poor man's fight, but that to those to whom much is given, of them shall much be required. That an American should sit back and count his blessings and then feel like, you know, there's obligation that comes with the blessings that I have. And what would education and wealth and leadership and social connection and all of that mean if I won't risk it in a time of crisis, if I won't put my resources into serving my country when things get tough? That was a lesson they wanted driven home. I think they did drive that lesson home. Next week, we will again be visiting the Yankee Cavalry, and we will hear about Sheridan at Cedar Creek. I'm sorry, Thursday, not next week. In the meantime, I think they gave us a lot to think about. Does anybody have a question or a comment today?